This is a brief introduction to LegSim for the class administrator. What I'd like to do is talk about the overall organization of the site and then also about sort of the special features that are available to the teacher/administrator of the simulation. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is when you log in, you're going to be at the administrator desk. This is essentially the same position in the site as a student would see when they logged in. So it's essentially your profile page. And then if you look across the top, you've got the organization of the simulation. So these are the different elements of the simulation, and they're organized roughly in terms of the sequence of the legislative process. So the first thing that has to happen is students need to build their profiles. And their profiles are sort of the holding place for all of the things that they're going to do in the simulation. So if a student introduces a bill, that bill is going to be linked to their profile. If a vote occurs, the vote will be visible on the profile, etc. After students have created their profiles, the next thing is to get organized. And so here's where they have the ability to form caucuses and parties. And similarly, here's where students are going to make requests for the different committees that you've decided are available for your particular simulation. And then ultimately, this is also the landing page for accessing a committee. Once the legislature has been organized, the next step is to submit legislation. And this is where the student submits legislation. It's also where information about existing legislation, where it's at in different stages of the process and that sort of thing is available. And then finally, once committees have deliberated and presumably reported some legislation out of committee, then the legislation moves to the floor calendar. And it's at this point where the leadership makes decisions about what they want to see considered on the floor. By default, LegSim has a very hardwired process for floor consideration. In the Senate, you've got the motion to proceed, and you have the opportunities to filibuster. In the House, you have the calendar, and then you have the Rules Committee as a means for getting around the normal process for bringing bills up according to their order in the calendar. One thing I want to mention before I forget is that one of the powers of the administrator is to override this process. So if you decide that you want to bring a bill to the floor without having to go through the normal hardwired procedures, then you as the administrator can do that. The chamber leader/student doesn't have the ability to do that. And finally, once legislation, if you're lucky, once legislation makes it out of the chamber, it goes to the White House, where your president, should you choose to have one, can issue a veto message or not. Currently, the president does not have the ability to specifically veto a bill, so this sort of has to be managed somewhat creatively. So presumably the president would announce a veto message, and then the chamber would have to introduce and pass a resolution overriding the president's veto by a 2/3 majority. Okay. A couple of other things I want to draw your attention to in terms of organization. Tutorials are found here. And then finally, there's some tips under instruction. So you've got the sample bill, the sample committee report, and then some suggestions for the instructors about how to manage your site. So those are tips about the tools available to the administrator. Okay, there's just a couple more things I want to point your attention to. So the first is, if I'm at the administrator's desk, you can see that there's this assume user account option. And what this means is that I can choose any student in this class, and I can view LegSim from their perspective. So if you're the administrator, you're not necessarily going to see what a student sees. So sometimes if a student is having difficulty, you might want to assume their account and try to understand the problem from their perspective. All right, the last thing I wanted to mention was the administrative tools that are available to the administrator. And so on the bottom, there's a small link. If you are logged in as administrator, you can access this. And what you'll see here is a bunch of options that are only available to the administrator. So for example, under committees, you can decide what committees you want in your legislature. So there is a default set that reflect the actual committees in the U.S. Senate. You can choose to have fewer committees, for example, if you have a smaller class and that sort of thing. This is where you would do that. And there are a lot of options here, so this is where you would override the current hardwired voting process. Some of these are not currently working, but the important ones are. You can delete a member if necessary. You can assign leaders to posts. And then this one is particularly useful, that at the end of your simulation you can download a CSV file which has activity information about each of the students in your class, so it gives you a good indicator of participation, at least one indicator of participation that you can use along with the others. You can also update the tutorials if you wanted to add your own tutorials, and then up at the top here, these are the master settings for your simulation. So if you wanted to change something, for example, allow committees to be referred out of committee without requiring a recorded vote, then you could do that here. That's my introduction to the administrator, and you might want to take a look at the member tutorial next. Thanks.